Hello, everyone. So, I received a question recently from a fellow clarinetist who's interested in learning to play quarter tones, particularly in order to play Iranian music on the clarinet. And this person was wondering if I had any resources, like a fingering diagram or a book or something that I learned to play quarter tones from. Now, to be honest, I don't really. I pretty much made up most of the fingerings that I use for quarter tones through a process of trial and error, but I thought I'd go ahead and just make a little instructional video on how I approach finding quarter tone fingerings on the clarinet. So let's get started with a tangent. In order to explain quarter tone fingerings, I actually find it really helpful to draw a parallel to older Baroque and classical era woodwind instruments. These instruments were pretty simple, as you can see on this classical clarinet. There are very few keys, mostly open tone holes, and that's because these instruments were designed basically to play diatonic music, not chromatic music. They could only comfortably play in home keys like F and C and G major with few accidentals. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a classical clarinet to demonstrate with here, but I do have this very silly bright blue plastic recorder, which is basically the same thing, just with a recorder mouthpiece and not a clarinet mouthpiece. So let's say you're a Baroque recorder player and your buddy Tony Vivaldi writes you a cool new recorder concerto, and you're reading through it and you see a passage that goes something like this. So there's a G sharp there, but there's no G sharp on the recorder. There's a G, there's A. So how do you play these chromatic notes? So as it turns out, you can play a G sharp. You just have to use something called a forked fingering. So what we have to do is we have to start with the note A, skip the G tone hole, and add fingers further down the instrument to lower the pitch of the A until it's an A flat. And incidentally, it also changes the tone color. They tend to be kind of shaded, darker sounding fingerings. So now we can play that passage. Until they developed instruments later on that had keys to play chromatic notes, forked fingerings were how all woodwind instruments played chromatic passages. So what does any of this have to do with playing quarter tones on the modern clarinet? Well, much like the old clarinets were designed only to play diatonic music, and we had to get creative with the fingerings in order to play chromatic music, this thing is only designed to play chromatic music, and we have to get creative to find quarter tone fingerings. So basically, my process is start with standard fingerings, and start shading things and using fork fingerings in order to find quarter tone fingerings. Here's an easy example to start with. Let's play the standard fingering for a second register F. And what we're going to do is normally, if we wanted to play an E, so play a half step, we would add the second finger. What we're going to do is we're going to skip this tone hole, and instead we're going to put down the third finger to create a forked fingering. And what we're going to hear is F to F quarter flat. Another easy example is if we play a high B and then add similarly the third finger, we end up with a B quarter flat. Now on the modern clarinet, we also have all of these keys, and some of them actually do raise the pitch of standard fingerings, incidentally, by a quarter tone. So if we start with a standard B flat fingering and then add the other B flat key on the left hand, we end up with a B quarter flat. So as you can see, we can start with a B natural and add a forked fingering in order to lower it to a B quarter flat, or we can start from below from a B flat and add a key to raise the pitch. So now I'm just going to go through the second register of the clarinet and show you some quarter tone fingerings that I use. The reason we're starting in the second register is that forked fingerings don't work that well in the low register. It's true of the old instruments too. That's why you rarely see chromatic passages down in the low register of the clarinet in classical music. So our options are a little bit limited down low. There are quarter tone fingerings that exist, and I'll show you some of them, but let's start in the second register. Alright, so we're going to start on B natural. Now, in order to play B quarter sharp, if your clarinet has the low F correction key, you can just add that. If your clarinet doesn't have the low F correction key, you'll have to bring your thumb up from the thumb rest, so you'll have to be sitting down or wearing a neck strap most likely, and you'll press the top trill key. To get from C to C quarter sharp, you'll also have to bring your thumb up, and this time you'll press both the top trill keys. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a really good fingering for D quarter flat. The best thing I've found on my instrument is to play C sharp and add the F correction key and the top two trill keys. It's a little flat, but it gets us in the ballpark. But for any composers listening to this, I would maybe advise against writing D quarter flats if the pitch is really important. You can also just start on the note D and shade the C sharp key until you get into the ballpark. It doesn't sound very good, and the pitch is a little unstable, but it works. To play D quarter sharp, or E 3/4 flat, I start on E flat, and I just add the B key to bring the pitch down. You might have to lip it down a little bit too, because it tends to be on the sharp side. For E quarter flat, I actually do the same thing. I start on an E, and I add the B key. For E quarter sharp, or F quarter flat, I do what I showed before, where I start on F natural, and I just add the third finger. For F quarter sharp, or G 3/4 flat, I have to think about these sometimes, I start on F sharp, or G flat, and I add the third finger. For G quarter flat, or F 3/4 sharp, I start on F sharp, and I add the sliver key with my third finger. For G quarter sharp, I actually start with G sharp and I add the second finger. You might also have to add the C key to bring the pitch down all the way. For A quarter flat, I start with A and I add the second and third fingers of the right hand. For A quarter sharp, I actually start with G sharp and I add the side B flat key. For B quarter flat, I either start with side B flat and add the other B flat key, or I start from B natural and I shade the third finger. For B quarter sharp, I start with B natural and I add both the side B flat and the sliver key. Now I haven't explored the altissimo register as much, but to get to C quarter sharp, I actually start from C sharp and I add both the third finger and the E flat key. You might have to pinch that one up a little bit. Maybe there's a better fingering that I haven't found. For D quarter flat, I start on D and I add the third finger. Now when we string all those together, the chromatic notes and the quarter tone notes, it'll sound something like this. You'll hear the first few notes are a little awkward just navigating the fingerings, but the rest of the register is pretty fluid. I'm not going to go through the whole lower register because I'm still figuring that out for myself, but I'll show you a few quarter tone fingerings in that range and how to approach finding fingerings. For the throat tones, I generally start with a standard fingering and add fingers to bring the pitch down. So for example, if we start with the side B natural and add actually the first finger and just keep adding fingers until we end up with a quarter tone. For G quarter flat, I start with the standard F sharp fingering and I add the 2 side keys. For F quarter sharp, you can start on the standard F sharp fingering and add the 3rd finger, and I would probably add the whole right hand, including the B key, in order to get it down to pitch. For E quarter flat, unfortunately the forked fingering, as I said before, doesn't work so well in the lower register. It doesn't quite bring down the pitch enough. So what I do instead is I use the side E flat and add the other sliver E flat key. For D quarter flat, the best thing I've found is to just start with D and add the whole right hand, including the B key. It's a little stuffy. For C quarter sharp, I start with C sharp and I add probably the 2nd and 3rd fingers. Also a fairly stuffy fingering, as you can hear. For B quarter sharp or C quarter flat, I use the standard B fingering and add the sliver key. I haven't really found a good B quarter flat fingering down there. It's just everything is too sharp and stuffy. You can try playing a low G and actually sort of mashing the sliver key at the same time. It's a little awkward. It's not quite in tune either, but it's something. For B quarter flat, I start on B flat and I add the 3rd finger and the C key. If it's not too sharp, you can also add the C sharp key to give it a little more resonance. For A quarter flat, your best bet is just to half hole it. Adding the B key doesn't bring it down enough. Beyond this point, there aren't really quarter tone options available. The pitch becomes very inflexible and you're dealing with keys, so unless you open or close the key halfway, you're not really going to get a quarter tone. The only exception is if your clarinet has this low F correction key. You can actually play a low E and add the correction key and you'll get an E quarter sharp. And that's just totally a coincidental design quirk. But as you can see, it's always either shading standard fingerings to bring the pitch down a quarter tone, or adding keys to bring the pitch up a quarter tone. Now obviously these fingerings tend to be a little bit awkward, and that's just because our instruments haven't been designed to play in these keys, and much like chromatic music was awkward on older clarinets, quarter tone music is a little awkward on modern clarinet. But it's very doable. You just have to find combinations of notes that work smoothly. As an example, I really like this scale where you take the octave and you divide it into 8 equal tones, and each tone is actually 3/4 of a whole step. So it sounds like this if you start on D natural. So I hope that was helpful. As you can see, pretty much I just arrived at all of these through messing around with fingerings until I found something that works. And you may find better fingerings than I ever did. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to DM me or put something in the comments, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. And I hope this was helpful.